Good evening, everybody. It is 6:03 p.m. on December 2nd, 2021. This is a meeting of the Somerville Planning Board. Pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, this meeting of the Somerville Planning Board will be conducted via remote participation. A recording of these proceedings can be accessed at any time using the registration link at the top of this agenda. This meeting is being recorded. With me tonight is Erin Gino, Rob Buchanan, Jahan Habib, and Debbie Howard Easton. I will ask Debbie just to say hello because she's not on camera.
Hello.
Okay, we do have a quorum. We have one item on the agenda this evening. It is under other business. It's recommendations to the Land Use Committee. This is following up on several different hearings that the Planning Board and also with the Land Use Committee have held on recommendations for amendments to the ordinance. And the one that we have left tonight is item 212471, that the zoning ordinances be amended by striking all language from section 8.3.1.10.c to prevent parking maximums in master plan development areas being exceeded by special permit. This is something that was originally raised at the joint hearing several weeks ago. It was not raised at the planning board meeting on the 18th and has been continued to tonight for discussion and likely a vote for recommendation by the board to the committee. So I don't believe that there are any members of the public in attendance, but if there are, we are not taking testimony this evening. This is just for a discussion between members of the planning board and of city staff. Before we continue, I would ask members of staff. I know that George Proakis is in attendance. I don't know if George has a presentation or advice for the board, because I've certainly got some questions, but if George or if Dan have a presentation or anything that they'd like to make, I would absolutely welcome that before we commence discussion.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. I have not prepared anything new other than the presentation that you saw at the joint hearing. And you may recall that that particular presentation at the joint hearing was focused on the idea that we felt that there was a kind of collision course between the proposal to eliminate the special permit and some of the major changes that have occurred in the numbers, particularly focusing on the Boynton Yard sub area, although it could potentially be an issue in other sub areas, which had basically brought the parking ratio relative to the amount of commercial development we could now get there to such a low point that it would actually impact the commercial development, make some real risky situations surrounding our ability to do additional development in Boynton, particularly on the Nissenbaum Auto Parts land and some of the stuff that hasn't been to your board for permitting yet. I made a recommendation at that meeting that if they really wanted to remove the special permit provision, what they really needed to do is sort of do a reset on the parking number and look at a parking number that actually worked. I focused on the number 0.6 per thousand because it is an aggressively low number, but it is still relatively within the area, whereas a blended rate for commercial and residential, we could see some outcomes that could still work. I used some numbers from Boston and some examples related to that. I have been back in front of the Land Use Committee twice to talk about this since we did the joint hearing. And at those meetings, I've had a lot of conversation with the counselors about the possibility of a version of this that would not actually eliminate the special permit, but at least in the short term, have a version that might maintain the special permit, but only allow you to go to 0.6, and then someday maybe move to a version that actually just has 0.6 be the number without the special permit. But the piece that's in front of you today, the key piece that's in front of you today, which is the elimination of the special permit, which would take away your board's ability to get into the depths of these questions and understand the changes that have occurred since the Boynton Yards plan set at 1,500 spaces cap and where we are today, where I think the 0.6, which comes out to about 2,040, 2,050, is probably the the right number to do. I had a lot of discussion with the council about it. I answered a lot of their questions. I think the best way to handle discussion with the planning board is I'm happy to answer your questions. But I would urge you not to support this particular amendment unless you are specific to the council that those other changes have to go along with it in order to make it work. That's where we are at this point.
George, thanks very much. I do remember that at the joint hearing, there were a few maps that either you or Dan had put up, and I'm sure in the public record, that showed the ratios in, as you were saying, different neighborhoods of Boston, specifically what's near transit, what's not near transit, where there are commercial districts, where there are more residential districts. And I thought that was very helpful in the way I thought about this this proposed amendment. So I appreciate, I'm a visual learner, so I appreciate seeing the maps and having an idea of what is it that we're actually talking about if we don't go with the language of this particular proposal, but go towards some sort of a modification or a compromise, where that compromise might wind up and what would make sense to do that. So I thought that was very helpful. So I want to thank you and your staff for laying out your thoughts in a way that kind of moved the way I saw this.
And just to add, in addition to that Boston map, which really lays out a rate and talks about 0.8 in Charlestown and the 0.6 at Fan Pier is the way they're going forward. I got a question from the council yesterday, which we did some research into and answered, or 2 days ago, which we answered 2 nights ago, about Kendall Square specifically. Kendall, its current rate across Kendall is about 0.9 per thousand. And the new projects they're permitting, all but one are 0.8, and the one that isn't is 1.0, is higher than that. So the 1500 space at Boynton comes to 0.45, which is really low, and 0.6, which is the equivalent of Fan Pier or Longwood, is kind of where we see the right sweet spot for districts like Boynton. And my goal would be to carry that number across the other master plan districts at this point. I think it would make sense at Brick Bottom and Innerbelt as well.
All right. George, thank you. I don't know if anybody else on the board has any questions of George or of anybody on staff before we invite George to go back to home, unless you want to stick around. Yeah, Rob.
Just for clarification purposes, with respect to kind of the proposed ordinance to remove the planning board's, ability to grant a special permit. If we're strictly kind of being asked to make a recommendation on that piece, I'll just say, I'm comfortable sort of just, purely on purely for the sake of retaining this board's existing authority to oppose that. But if we start getting into, and I don't believe what we are, but I know that the conversation has come up. What is the right number? Is it 1,500? Is it 2,150 or whatnot? I don't think we are anywhere near coming to a decision or clarity around that. I know there is an existing process that's ongoing that I know that the city is taking to look at all of these streets and come up with a proposal for how to change or improve the street network in and around Union Square, including some of the intersections that get into Boynton Yards. And I'll just say, I would be, if we were faced with a project tomorrow on, moving forward on some large expansion, I would be hard pressed to be able to make a call on that until I have a better sense of like what's in the works. Because as it stands, morning, noon, evening, it's already gridlock, and Boynton Yards, it's hardly even open for business yet. I don't think the current lab building is even occupied. So I just, I think I think the conversation that we've been having is what's the right number to meet a certain build out goal. But the conversation that we haven't been having is what can our street network support? And thus far, it hasn't changed in any material way. And I think that that conversation is something that this board is going to have to grapple with. But on the decision that we're being asked to make tonight, to support the proposed amendment as written, I'm comfortable recommending against it purely for the sake of maintaining this board's authority going forward.
I through the chair, if I may, I think that may be an easy solution to this particular issue, and let us live another day to talk about the next set of items. There was an interesting conversation at the council on Tuesday night. Brad Rawson was there with us about some of the way that the practice in transportation engineering and planning has evolved in the last 6 years since the Union Square plan came forward, because the original 1,500 number was based upon a build-out calculation, not a traffic calculation. And for many years, I mean, certainly, I'll tell the world how old I actually am. In the early 90s, when I was an engineering student in college studying transportation analysis and planning, you learned about calculating parking generation and you learned about calculating trip generation, and they were two completely separate things. And I'm surprised that in 20 years, the practice hadn't come much farther than that. But in the last 5 or 6 years, there is more talk about that, and there is more discussion about the link between, if I put a big garage here, that actually creates trip generation. It's not just you calculate, there's 400 people working in a lab building that creates trip generation, but how much parking you have, there's this link and this discussion about it, and how that relates to the traffic network. The world of transportation engineering models is still emerging on that front, so we're still kind of pushing people on the cutting edge to try to answer some of those questions. And there's a lot of discussion to have on that. Probably not all at tonight's planning board meeting when we're talking in theory. Of course, if you leave the special permit in place and we make no change, you'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about that, because you'll have applicants coming before you seeking that special permit, which, by the way, has a lot of things in it that are supposed to be provided to you as a part of that conversation to determine whether or not to grant it. If, on the other hand, we move to the point where we cap how far the special permit can go, which the council might do, that's fine too, but we still have the special permit. And if at the end we go to a point where we release the special permit and go to a permanent cap, well, that's a separate zoning item that will be in front of you for a future recommendation. So as for tonight, you don't necessarily have to tackle that issue, but it is an emerging conversation, definitely.
I'll echo Rob with the sort of support of not recommending this particular amendment, surely for the sort of flexibility in the toolkit, the planning board, right? If we want to build out Boynton, saying you can't have more than 1,500 cars, and if you need more than 1,500 cars, it's a variance. Or I presume is a variance, right? That's maybe not the best way to go about planning. I mean, I really like this 0.6 kind of metric where it's a ratio per thousand. So it's really sort of tied to how much development's actually happening. I think that makes a ton of sense. I would almost think as well, and thank you, Director Proakis, for answering the question that I had, was how did the 1,500 number come about, right? Not necessarily as a traffic analysis, but as a build out metric. And I do wonder if, as we think about exceeding the sort of 1,500 number by special permit, if we should be considering the sort of capability of the road network to handle the additional traffic as part of the special permit. I don't know if that's sort of a thing for today, but just a thought. Would that make sense? I would be curious to hear you and my fellow board members' thoughts on that.
Chair, if I may, it may make a lot of sense as long as there is a good data collection system to be able to make determinations surrounding that. And one of the challenges is you are pushing actually on the research edge of where the engineering profession actually is on this. But the question is a viable question. and I don't have in front of me, Mr. Bartman might have in front of him, the original ordinance as it's written, because I do recall that if you get to a special permit on this, you do have to provide a bunch of information to the planning board to get this special permit. I don't know if relation to traffic is one of those things, but I do know there are provisions there. But yeah, but to reflect back on your first point, the 1500 was based on a build out analysis, and there were two things that changed in the build out analysis. It was a smaller total build out, and the build out had a higher percentage residential in it from where we ended up in the 2019 zoning, which allowed us to put a smaller parking number on, because we also thought the residential blend was going to be closer, which would have allowed things to sort of spread out a little bit more. That all shifted. That's where we kind of got to the point where we had a developer say to the public, hey, I'm probably going to ask for this special permit, which in turn caused the public to go to the councilors and the councilors to propose an amendment, which is what got us here today. So I'll let him answer his half of that question, but thanks.
Excuse me, if I may, Mr. Chair, it would probably be really interesting to do a follow-up presentation with your board that I could give, or me and Brad could give, about the current status of the analytical fields that research this. I think you'll be very surprised about how much they don't know. The field doesn't currently have an ability to estimate the amount of humans that come and go from these uses. The way they estimate that is by extrapolating on the suburban car counts that are observed coming and going to these uses, that they then multiply by a carpool amount to determine an estimated amount of humans, right? Which you then distribute through all of the modes that are possible. But that is a poor starting point to begin with. So there is a lot of effort going on in places like California to totally redo how this analysis works and shift from things, for instance, like do the additional cars break the street network versus does the new business or the new development decrease the vehicle miles traveled by all of the people that have come to that building? It is a whole new way of looking at that. So that would be a whole nother conversation to have. Very interesting other business presentation maybe we could do in the future. But I think the two things that George really highlighted that I would want to reemphasize with this is that permit was there because we anticipated potentially additional commercial development coming from above and beyond what our predictions were, and that's exactly what we experienced. And so to then lose the special permit, I think would reduce the flexibility that we always thought needed to be in this, like you highlighted. And so that's really the two things, is that if the build out's going to change and there's less residential involved, the special permit was written to address additional commercial demand, and that is the exact reality we find ourselves in.
Thanks, Dan. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur with my fellow board members regarding the recommendation against this proposal. I think that we would need to better understand some of the data considerations that Dr. Proikis has highlighted. In addition, what I'm most curious about, and this is a question through you, Mr. Chair, directed towards Director Proikis, is with respect to these emerging conversations. I'm very interested in hearing and continuing these conversations. Do you have an understanding of what the time frame might look like, without of course pinning down a specific month or date or anything like that?
Well, so in terms of the issue around the 0.6 situation, I think that if something passes or doesn't pass the council, they may want this 0.6 number back in a new amendment early next year, which would suggest to me that somewhere around, I don't know, February or March, you're going to end up in a joint hearing with them with this 0.6 number back in front of you, whether this particular one passes or not, or passes in some format or not. And that would really open up the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper. I think that the Nissenbaum site is under agreement, and you're likely to at some point see somebody who wants to pursue a master plan on that particular site probably by summer. And at some point in time, that's going to reach you as well. And I can't imagine they can go forward with either this 0.6 issue being settled or some other number being settled, or having the special permit and being in front of you asking under the special permit, at which point all the questions that, starting with Mr. Buchanan's questions that we all started talking about, are going to come back in front of your board. So somewhere, but before one of those two things happens, I think it is a good chance to sort of dig back into this bigger question about the link between traffic and parking and how to address those issues.
That is extremely helpful, Director Proikis, and I also wanted to mention that it would be terrific to have Mr. Bergman do a presentation, so that way we are a little bit more aware and a bit more well versed, at least in my case, well versed in the considerations that will be coming up. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
Thanks, John. Since Debbie's not on video, I don't know if she wants to provide any comment.
Yeah, I'll just quickly, because I don't have a ton to add, except to say I concur with the rest of my colleagues here, particularly as we're talking about this sort of, data collection methods changing and sort of this being a burgeoning issue and it being a critical issue, I think, for Somerville in terms of the, the tandem values of, Summer Vision in terms of how we were looking for certain types of development to happen, but also trying to reduce vehicle traffic coming through the city and to the city. So I'm hesitant to give up the flexibility that the special permit allows wholeheartedly without having some modifications along the lines of what Director Proikis was talking about at a minimum in terms of adjusting the figures. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Debbie. So I think we're all at least on the same page that I start from the position that where the board has been given some degree of discretion and some degree of review, that it's a good thing to retain. Because I always figure that where there is more discussion about individual projects and proposals and potential special permits, that it makes for a better project and a better process to at least have a discussion on whether certain things are appropriate. For example, several years ago, I think it would have been before George came in, the planning board used to be an advisory board to certain ZBA decisions. Everything the ZBA actually had on its agenda would go to the planning board first. So we would hash out with residents in a public meeting, not a public hearing, issues that people had with certain applications, small stuff, dormers, porches, things like that. But by the time it got to the ZBA, most of the issues had been worked out through our meeting. And a number of years ago, we got rid of the dual review, and I actually voted against getting rid of the dual review because I always thought that when you discuss things, it makes it a better process and it comes out to a better product. I think the same is true here. Just because we have the authority to give special permits on parking doesn't mean we will, but it means we can. And I don't agree with the theory that taking away our discretion, which can or cannot, or would not be actually exercised in giving a special permit, is beneficial, because I think it artificially constrains what applicants can potentially do through the public process in making good development. So on those grounds alone, I would agree with all of you that this is not on its face something that we should recommend for adoption. So that's part one. Part two, I have no idea whether 0.6 is the right number, whether it's going to be 0.8, whether it's going to remain at 0.45. I don't know. I think there is, as we all said, and as Dan and George were pretty clear on, there's a lot of data that needs to be analyzed to figure out what actually should be the right number. And until that number has been determined through the actual planning and use and development of Boynton Yards and other master plan developments in the city, I don't think it makes sense necessarily for this board to recommend a set figure. I think one of the recommendations that we can make is that we don't adopt a particular figure yet. We don't get rid of the special permit, but that the city look toward potentially modifying the ratio, or one that can be adjusted in the future. I mean, what if in 2 years we say 0.6 is the number, and then we realize 5 years down the road it's not. I don't want to go back and move it again and change the goalposts. I'd like to have potentially some idea of a flexible ratio depending on, and I think that comes into discussions around special permits and what staff find might be the best use of those ratios on the ground as developments are coming to us and applications are coming to us. So I would make the recommendation that we not recommend the proposal as it's written. We don't have, the recommendation doesn't have to say because we don't want to give up the discretion that we currently have. But I think it is a reasonable recommendation that we say we don't want to do what you're saying is just get rid of the special permit and the discretion altogether. I think what we can, and what I gather the consensus on the board to be, is that we look at this a little bit further, that we try to figure out what the appropriate remedy is, because the 0.45 isn't, doesn't seem to be working. Seems like it's going to artificially constrain good development in certain areas, and that's not something that we want to do. But we also don't know exactly what it is that we should be recommending because we're still working through the process. I think that comprises kind of the consensus of what I heard on the board and what I also agree with. So if you all have additional things that you'd like to include in a recommendation, let me know. But I think that recommendation, which is we are recommending against the proposal as written, but we are encouraging the Board of Aldermen and the city to look at what an appropriate remedy for this situation would be. Because when these were created, it was before we had development, before we knew what was going on, before things may or may not have changed, and things do change. So if anybody has, yes, I saw Aaron first.
What's that? Did you say Robert?
I saw Aaron's hand first.
All right.
Mute. You are muted. Aaron, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I say, I totally agree. I think you make a really good point about the ratio and that we don't really fully understand, where 0.6 seems reasonable. I mean, I would encourage the city to find an aggressively low ratio, whatever that makes sense as. Again, to minimize the number of trips, traffic, et cetera, in sort of line with Summer Vision 2040. I also would be curious to hear your thoughts on, it would be the ideal situation to me is we get a special permit, we evaluate it on a case-by-case basis, which is the benefit of the planning board, where we can do case by case as opposed to the whole sector. But can we do, special permit conditions that are maybe more functional to help us define good development versus bad development, or the kinds of development we want in Summer Vision 2040 versus potentially some others? Like I'm kind of thinking like by granting this special permit, we would be able to fully realize the Prisby plan, right? And realign South Street and do all the good things that we want as part of this development. But if we were to say this particular one would be a ratio of like 1.2 for this one building, and it has no impact on realigning South Street kind of thing. So like, I think my question is maybe what tools can we give ourselves to be able to say no when a special permit comes before us for more parking for development that maybe doesn't quite align with the kinds of good development we've been talking about.
So, Aaron, I think that is absolutely something that we should try to figure out as kind of applications come to us or in future meetings, but for a purpose of a recommendation to the land use committee, I think that's getting a little bit in the weeds on how we would want to evaluate our own special permits. But I think that is something that definitely merits, a broader evaluation, in the next couple of weeks or months. But yeah, so thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Rob?
Yeah, just on that, I think our authority already allows us a great deal of discretion when it comes to these exact considerations. I mean, that's just my sense. But one thing I did want to just articulate was, and I don't have the language in front of me right now, but I'm almost certain when we go through those findings and required considerations for various projects, I can't remember if it's under the context of the master plan special permit or a site plan approval. I'm almost certain we are like required to look at considerations on impacts on the transportation network. So that's already kind of within our required sort of purview, if you will. But what I did want to say was I'm really glad this ordinance came up, because I think it's pushing a conversation that this community needs to have. And I think it's much broader than just Boynton Yards or Union Square. I mean, if you dump as currently zoned, 1,500 parking spots in Union Square and 1,500 parking spots in Boynton Yards, I assure you there will be gridlock on the streets, as is. So, I mean, there already is. So I think that, and when I start thinking about Grand Junction and Brick Bottom and Interbell and Assembly, I start to wonder, maybe we need to have a broader conversation around not what's the parking cap in Boynton Yards, but what's the parking cap in Somerville? How many more parking spots do we want to add to the city writ large? And what's that impact on induced traffic? And I know that that's a very difficult question to answer, because the science of induced traffic demand is very sort of in its infancy to some extent with respect to parking. But I do think I'm glad to hear that we're having this conversation, and I think it's probably going to become one of the hot sort of lightning rod topics that we have project after project after project that comes before us going forward. Is this is probably going to keep coming up. So I'm glad we're having this, and whenever you're ready to vote, I am. So thanks for the conversation.
Thanks. So I think we have a consensus on. Dan, did you want to? I saw in the comments that you wanted to address something, but I don't know if you still want to.
I was going to, but then you said, let's have that conversation. That's a bigger conversation. Let's have it at another date. And I'm eager to have that. That's really why I spoke up. So I'll look forward to that in the future.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think we're at a place now where we can vote on a recommendation, and I will, I think, summarize the will of the board by moving to recommend that the land use committee not adopt the proposal as written, but that the city and the committee and the planning board work together in figuring out what the correct ratio should be, if it should be malleable or fixed, subject to special permits, and to further discussion to make sure that we actually have the development that that we want and that we need. Seconded by Aaron, who I see nodding. Roll call vote. The chair votes aye.
Jahan votes aye.
Rob votes aye.
Aaron votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
We have a unanimous recommendation. Thank you all very much. That is everything that is on our agenda. The next meeting that we have is the 16th at 6 o'clock. So thank you all very much. Have a good night. Chair moves to adjourn, seconded by Aaron. Chair votes aye.
Jahan
Aaron
votes
votes-
aye.
Rob votes aye.
Debbie votes aye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Good night.